The Morning Ledger. Perspective: a newspaper delivery boy. Setting: late autumn 1944. The world is a different place at 4:30 in the morning. It's quieter, sure, but it's heavy too. The dark feels thicker, like molasses, and the only thing cutting through it is the rhythmic click, whir, click of my bicycle chain and the slop of rubber tires on wet pavement. My name is Mickey, and I'm the eyes and ears of Maple Street, even if nobody knows it. I had the Daily Ledger tucked tight under my arm, the bundle secured with rough twine that bit into my mittens. The papers were still warm from the press, smelling of hot lead, wet ink, and the kind of urgency you only get during wartime. Down at the distribution shack, Old Man Miller had shouted, "Get the lead out, boys. The Allies took another hill in Italy, and the folks need to know." We all pedaled a little harder after that. The wind on Maple Street had teeth that morning. It nipped at my ears and found the gap between my scarf and my collar, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I pedaled past the Victory Gardens, now just patches of frosted mud and sleeping cabbage, looking like little graveyards in the moonlight. I coasted toward the Kaplan House first. It was a modest bungalow with peeling white paint, but the walkway was always swept clean. Mrs. Kaplan was standing there behind the screen door, just a silhouette in a faded housecoat. She was always awake. I don't think she'd slept a full night since her boy, Davy, shipped out to the Pacific in 1942. I slowed down, reached into my bag, and, with a practiced flick of the wrist, tossed the paper. It landed with a solid thwack right on the welcome mat. Mrs. Kaplan pushed the door open before the paper even stopped sliding. She stepped out into the chill, her breath puffing like a little steam engine. She didn't look at the headline, not yet. She looked at me. She gave a small, tired wave, her hand trembling just a bit. "Morning, Mickey," she whispered, though I could barely hear her over the wind. "Morning, Mrs. K," I called back, trying to sound cheerful. "Cold one today." She nodded, clutching the collar of her robe. I knew what she was doing. She was steeling herself. She was going to take that paper inside, pour a cup of weak, rationed coffee, and scour the back pages. She wasn't looking for stock prices or the funny papers. She was looking for names. I pedaled on, guilt sitting in my stomach like a stone. I was just the delivery boy, but sometimes it felt like I was delivering grenades, not news. 2 houses down was Mr. Henderson's place. A stark difference. The lights were blazing in the kitchen, casting yellow squares onto the frosted lawn. Mr. Henderson worked at the munitions plant across town. Swing shift or early bird, I never knew which. He was already at the window, a ceramic mug in his hand, his tie knotted so tight it looked like it was choking him. He didn't wave. He never did. He just nodded, a sharp military jerk of the chin. Acknowledgement received. Carry on, soldier. I tossed his paper. It hit the porch railing and fell to the concrete. A sloppy throw. "Sorry, Mr. Henderson," I muttered to myself, pushing hard on the pedals to get away before he could glare. The route continued like that for an hour. The rhythmic toss, the thud, the silence, the sensation of being the only living thing in a sleeping world. I imagined the stories tucked inside those folded pages. There were maps with arrows pointing toward Berlin and Tokyo. There were photos of men in muddy boots smoking cigarettes in places I couldn't pronounce. There were ads for soap that promised to keep your skin soft for when your G.I. Joe comes home. When the bag was finally light and the sun was just starting to bruise the horizon with purple and gray, I circled back to the corner of Main and Maple. I parked my jalopy of a bike against a lamppost and sat on the curb. My breath was still visible, but the numbness in my fingers was starting to fade into a dull ache. I had one paper left, a damaged copy, with a torn corner that Miller let me keep. I unfolded it, smoothing it out over my knees. The headline screamed about a tank offensive, big, bold letters. It felt huge. The world was burning and booming and changing 1,000 miles away. But here, on Maple Street, I looked down the row of houses. A milk truck was just turning the corner, the glass bottles clinking softly like wind chimes. A cat slinked along a fence line. The sun began to touch the tops of the chimneys. It was all so steady. Every house in its place, every morning exactly the same. The headline said the world was falling apart, but Maple Street was holding its breath, keeping it together with fresh paint and silent prayers. I folded the paper back up and shoved it into my coat pocket. I felt a strange sense of pride swell in my chest, warm and solid. I wasn't fighting in the trenches, and I wasn't building bombers like Mr. Henderson, but I was the one who woke the town up. I was the one who brought the world to their doorsteps. I hopped back on my bike, kicked the kickstand up, and pushed off. The sun was up. The day had officially begun. And everything was, for at least one more morning, safe and sound.
They called it the Windy City, but inside my third-floor room, the air was always still. It smelled of chalk dust, cheap fabric starch, and the lavender sachet I kept in my drawer to pretend I was living somewhere swanky. The room was a cracker box, barely big enough to change your mind in. I had my iron bed, my sewing table cluttered with pins and patterns, and a single window that looked out onto the fire escape. Every 20 minutes, the L train would roar past, rattling the window pane in its frame like a skeleton shivering in the cold. Clack, clack, whoosh. You got used to it. Eventually, it just became the heartbeat of the building. I was working on a hem for Mrs. Gabrowski. She wanted a dress that looked like something Rita Hayworth would wear, but she wanted it on a dime store budget. I was letting out the waist, again, and shortening the skirt just enough to be modern, but not enough to make the priest blush. "Gotta look sharp," she told me. "My husband's back from the Navy on Tuesday. I want to knock him dead." I bit the thread and smoothed the fabric. "You'll look like $1,000,000, Mrs. G," I'd said. It was Friday night. The clock on my dresser read 9 p.m. Outside, Chicago was waking up for the second time that day. The street lamps were humming, casting long, lonely shadows on the brickwork. And then it started. The music drifted up through the floorboards like smoke. It started with a piano, a rolling, tumbling, boogie-woogie bass line that made your toes twitch even if you were dead tired. Then came the trumpet, sharp and brassy, cutting through the low notes like a knife through butter. The apartment below belonged to a tailor named Russo, but on Friday nights his place turned into the hottest joint on the block. He had a nephew who played in a swing band, and after their gig at the club downtown, they'd all pile into Russo's living room to cool down. Only they didn't cool down, they heated up. I set my needle down. I couldn't help it. The rhythm was infectious. It crawled up the table legs and into my fingertips. It was a fast tune, something jumpy and frantic, full of that post-war energy where everyone was just so happy to be alive that they had to make noise about it. I pushed my chair back and walked to the center of the room. The floorboards vibrated beneath my stocking feet. I could hear laughter down there, loud, raucous guffaws and the high-pitched giggles of girls who probably painted seams on their legs with eyeliner because they couldn't afford real nylons. I closed my eyes. In the dark of my room, I wasn't Elsie, the seamstress with the pin-pricked fingers and the sore back. I was downstairs. I was wearing the emerald green satin dress I'd finished last week for a debutante on the Gold Coast. My hair was pinned up in a perfect victory roll, not a strand out of place. My lips were painted cherries in the snow red. I swayed, letting the phantom trumpet lead me. I imagined a hand on my waist, firm and sure. Maybe a soldier still in uniform, smelling of Old Spice and tobacco. Maybe a musician with clever hands. "Spin me," I whispered to the empty room. I twirled, my plain cotton skirt flaring out. The L train screamed past outside, drowning out the piano for a second, a metallic crescendo that mixed with the jazz. It was a chaotic symphony, gritty and beautiful. The song downstairs ended with a crash of keys and a smattering of applause. I stood still in the center of my room, breathing hard, my hand over my heart. For a moment, the silence of my apartment felt heavy, oppressive. The loneliness that usually hid in the corners came creeping out. I looked at the unfinished dress on the table, the pile of bills next to the lamp, the cold cup of tea. But then the piano started again, a slow ballad this time, something sweet and blue. I smiled, a small, private thing. I walked back to my chair and picked up my needle. I wasn't downstairs. I wasn't wearing satin. I was up here, stitching dreams together for other women. But as I drove the needle through the fabric, catching the rhythm of the song below, I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt connected. The joy down there, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the music, it was leaking into my life, seeping through the cracks. We were all just people stacked on top of each other in this big, noisy, beautiful city, trying to find a little warmth. "That's real swell," I murmured to the floorboards. I kept stitching, and for tonight, that was enough.
3. Lemonade on Main Street. Perspective: a shop owner's wife. Setting: a sweltering July afternoon, 1948. The heat in town was enough to melt the asphalt, shimmering in waves off the pavement like a mirage. It was one of those dog days of summer where the air feels heavy, like a wool blanket you can't shake off. My husband, Frank, had opened Miller's Hardware and Feed back in '45, right before the boys started coming home for good. We put everything we had into this place, every war bond cashed, every penny pinched. Now, 3 years later, the sign above the door was freshly painted in hunter green and cream, and Main Street finally felt like it belonged to us. I stood on the sidewalk, smoothing the front of my gingham dress. It was starched stiff. I wouldn't have it any other way. A lady has to keep standards, even when the thermometer is pushing 90. I had set up a small card table right under the awning, safe from the glaring sun. On it sat my prized possession, a heavy, cut glass pitcher sweating beads of condensation, filled to the brim with lemonade. Real lemons, too, not that powdered stuff we had to make do with during the rationing years. Sugar was back, lemons were back, and life was starting to taste sweet again. "You're gonna give away the profits, Martha," Frank had joked earlier, wiping grease off his hands with a rag as he watched me slice the fruit. "Oh, hush," I'd told him. "It's good for public relations. Besides, it's hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk." I sat on my stool and watched the town drift by. It was a slow parade of familiar faces. Old Mr. Abernathy walked past, tipping his fedora. He looked dapper despite the heat. "Afternoon, Mrs. Miller. You're looking ace today." "Why, thank you, Mr. Abernathy. Care for a cold one? On the house." He stopped, eyeing the pitcher like it was the Holy Grail. "Don't mind if I do." I poured him a glass. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal, a musical sound, cool and crisp.
He downed it in one go, wiped his mouth with a handkerchief, and sighed. Ah, that hits the spot. You're a lifesaver, Martha. School was out, so the street was peppered with kids. They'd press their noses against the hardware store window, staring at the new Schwinn bicycles Frank had lined up. Then they'd look at my lemonade. I'd wave them over and pour small cups. They looked at the floating ice cubes like they were magic diamonds. To them, maybe they were. I caught my reflection in the shop window between customers. My hair was set in perfect waves, pinned back neatly. My dress was crisp. Everything was orderly. I liked that. The world had been so messy for so long, so loud and frightening. But here, on this corner, things made sense. Inventory was counted, the sidewalk was swept, the books balanced. Around 6 o'clock, the sun began to dip low, casting long golden shadows across the street. The heat broke just a little, replaced by a gentle breeze that smelled of dry grass and cooling pavement. Frank flipped the sign on the door to "Closed" and stepped out. He looked tired. He'd been hauling bags of cement all afternoon, but his eyes were bright. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar. "And he left for the working man?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. I checked the pitcher. Just about. I poured the last glass. It was mostly melted ice by now, watered down and not nearly as tart, but he took it like it was champagne. He sat on the edge of the table and I stayed on my stool. We didn't say much. We just watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. "Good day?" he asked, taking a sip. "A real corker," I said softly. "Mrs. Higgins says her nephew is getting married, and the Johnsons are buying that farm out on Route 9. Frank nodded, looking out at the town. "Business is good, Martha. We're cooking with gas now." I looked at him, then at the empty street. The future felt wide open. The war was behind us, the store was full, and we were right where we were supposed to be. "Here," Frank said, offering me the glass. "Finish it." I took a sip. It was watery, sure, but standing there with my husband, watching the sun go down on our little slice of the world, it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. 3. Lemonade on Main Street. Perspective.
4. Sunday Best. Perspective. A young girl in rural Georgia. Setting. A Sunday morning, 1942. The rooster didn't even have to crow to wake me up. I was awake as soon as the gray light hit the floorboards, knowing what day it was. Sunday, the Lord's Day, and the only day I got to wear my blue sash. Mama was already in the kitchen, humming Rock of Ages while she scrubbed the skillet. The house smelled like bacon grease and chicory coffee, a smell that always made my stomach growl. "Hurry up, Sarah Jane," Mama called out, not turning around. "We don't want to be late. You know Reverend Thomas starts preaching right at 10, and he don't take kindly to stragglers." I pulled my Sunday dress off the hanger. It was a pale blue cotton thing with puff sleeves that scratched my arms a little, but I loved it. It made me feel like a grown-up lady. But as I pulled it on, my finger caught the hem. Rip! My heart stopped. I looked down. There, right at the bottom, the stitching had come loose. A flap of fabric hung down like a sad tongue. Tears pricked my eyes instantly. It was ruined. I was going to look like a ragamuffin. I ran into the kitchen, holding the skirt up. "Mama, look!" Mama wiped her hands on her apron and knelt down. Her face was stern, but her hands were gentle. She inspected the tear. "Oh, hush now, child. Don't carry on so. It's just a little snag." "But everyone will see," I sniffled. Mama smoothed my hair back, spitting on her thumb to tame a cowlick. "Sarah Jane, listen to me. People don't look at the bottom of your dress. They look at your face. You hold your head up high, you smile like you got the joy of the Lord in your heart, and nobody will notice a thread out of place." She pinned it quickly with a safety pin from her pocket, tucked it inside so it wouldn't show, and spun me around. "Now, grab your Bible." The walk to church was hot. The Georgia sun was already beating down on the red dirt road, kicking up dust that coated our shoes. Daddy walked ahead, his Bible tucked under his arm, his black suit looking hot enough to roast a turkey. The church itself was a white clapboard building that smelled of pine cleaner, old paper, and ladies' perfume, lilac and rosewater mostly. We slid into our pew, the wood hard against my back. It was stifling inside. The cardboard fans, stapled to wooden sticks and printed with a picture of Jesus or a local funeral home advertisement, waved back and forth in every row. Wish, 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 like 100 slow birds trying to fly away. When the choir stood up, the whole room seemed to lift off the ground. They sang, "I'll Fly Away," and the sound was so big it rattled the windows. I sang too. I opened my mouth wide and let it out. "Some glad morning when this life is o'er." Mama nudged me with her elbow. "Not so loud, Sarah," she whispered, though she was smiling. "I'm making a joyful noise," I whispered back. Reverend Thomas preached for an hour, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, talking about trials and tribulations. I didn't understand all of it, something about the war across the ocean and keeping the faith, but I liked the rhythm of his voice. It rose and fell like the wind in the trees. After the amen, the best part began, dinner on the grounds. We all spilled out of the church and under the giant oak tree in the yard. The grown-ups spread white tablecloths over wooden tables. Baskets were opened to reveal the treasures inside. Fried chicken that was still crispy, potato salad with paprika sprinkled on top, biscuits wrapped in cloth to keep 'em warm. I grabbed a biscuit and ran off with the other cousins. We sat in the dirt, tracing shapes with sticks, careful not to dirty our clothes too much. "I like your dress, Sarah Jane," my cousin Betty said. I froze, thinking of the safety pin, but she was looking at my sash. "The blue is real pretty." I smiled, remembering what Mama said. "Thank you," I said, lifting my chin just a little. The grown-ups stood in circles, the men smoking pipes and talking about crops and the draft, the women laughing about things they wouldn't tell us. The sun filtered through the oak leaves, dappling the ground with light. For a few hours under that tree, the world felt soft. The war felt far away. The week's work was done, and Monday hadn't touched us yet. I finished my biscuit and leaned back against the tree trunk, closing my eyes. Sundays were the best. They were the one day where everything was forgiven, fixed, and fed.
"5. Last streetcar home." Perspective: a factory worker in Detroit. Setting: November 1947, just after dusk. The whistle at the auto plant blew at 5 p.m. sharp, a long, mournful shriek that signaled the end of the shift. It was the sound of freedom, but it was also the sound of exhaustion. I punched my card at the clock, ka-chunk, and filed out the metal gates with 1,000 other men. We all looked the same: gray caps, heavy coats, grease stained into the lines of our hands like tattoos. We were the arsenal of democracy, they called us during the war. Now we were just making sedans for folks in the suburbs. The air outside was biting. Detroit in November is no joke. The wind whips off the river and cuts right through your wool coat. I huddled into my collar and made for the streetcar stop. The trolley came clattering down the tracks, sparks spitting blue and electric from the wire overhead. It groaned to a halt, the doors folding open with a hiss of pneumatics. I climbed on, dropped my nickel in the box, and found a seat near the back. The seats were woven rattan, worn smooth and shiny by years of tired backsides. The car smelled of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and ozone. It was a smell I'd known my whole life. I leaned my head against the cold glass as the car lurched forward. We didn't talk much, us riders. A nod here, a grunt there. We were all spent. The man across from me was asleep before we hit the second stop, his lunch pail rattling on his knees. I liked this time of day, though. It was the transition, the in-between time. Outside, the city was blurring past. Detroit was booming. Neon signs were flickering to life, bright reds and greens reflecting in the puddles. Eat at Joe's, Blue Ribbon beer, dancing. I saw families through the windows of the apartment buildings, a woman setting a table, a man tuning a radio. I imagined the sounds inside those rooms, the crackle of a news broadcast, the sizzle of pork chops, the kids arguing over homework. The streetcar rocked gently, a rhythmic clack-clack that usually put me to sleep, but tonight I kept my eyes open. I watched the city transform, the shift change, the day shift going home to rest, the night owls coming out to play. We passed the theater district, where the marquees were lit up like Christmas trees. Couples were walking arm in arm, dressed to the nines. I looked at my own reflection in the darkened window, tired eyes, soot on my cheek. I wasn't going to the theater. I wasn't a big shot, but I had $5 in my pocket. I had a pot roast waiting for me at home, and I had a girl, Mary, who would ask me how my day was and actually mean it. The conductor called out my street, Jefferson Avenue. I pulled the cord and stood up, my knees popping. I stepped off the tram and watched it rattle away into the dark, its tail light glowing like a red eye. The silence on my block was sudden and deep. The city noise faded to a hum in the distance. I walked the last block slow. The leaves crunched under my work boots. I saw the light on in my front window, the warm yellow glow. It wasn't a grand life. I wasn't a general, and I wasn't a movie star. I was a guy who tightened bolts on the assembly line. But as I walked up the front steps and reached for the doorknob, I felt a quiet sort of satisfaction settle in my chest. It was an honest life. It was paid for, and it was mine. I opened the door, and the smell of pot roast hit me. "That you, Al?" Mary called from the kitchen. "Yeah, doll," I said, closing the door on the cold night. "I'm home."
The morning